Before this story begins, I want you to imagine something that sounds impossible. A decorated U.S. Marine returns home after serving security at the 2026 World Cup, expecting to hug the father who raised him. Instead, he finds an elderly man kneeling outside the stadium, begging for leftover rice. And that man is his own father. But the most chilling part isn't the hunger. It's that a loyal German shepherd already knows someone is hiding the truth. What starts as one heartbreaking reunion soon uncovers a betrayal so cruel it will leave you questioning how far greed can tear a family apart, and how one faithful dog may become the only reason that family is saved. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if you believe families should never abandon those who once sacrificed everything for them. Now, let's begin. The late afternoon sun washed the towering walls of MetLife Stadium in warm gold as the last echoes of the 2026 FIFA World Cup final drifted into the summer sky. For most people, the match would become a memory. For Ethan Mercer, it would become the day his family nearly disappeared forever. Thousands of fans poured through the massive gates, wearing jerseys from every corner of the world. Children waved scarves taller than themselves. Street musicians played outside the station. Vendors shouted the last discounts on championship souvenirs, while television crews packed away cameras that had spent an entire month capturing history. The celebration sounded like hope. But hope had a strange habit of standing only a few feet away from heartbreak. Ethan Mercer walked slowly through the crowd, one gloved hand resting on the handle of a rolling duffel bag. At 43, he carried the posture that years in the United States Marine Corps had carved into him. Even after retirement, he never entered an open space without unconsciously mapping exits, rooftops, and blind corners. War trained a man to survive. It did not teach him how to come home. Beside him padded Titan, a 5-year-old German shepherd whose black and tan coat gleamed beneath the afternoon sun. His broad chest and alert amber eyes still reflected years of military canine service before an injured shoulder ended his operational career. To strangers, Titan looked intimidating. To Ethan, he was simply family. The dog ignored the cheering crowds and the smell of grilled food drifting across the plaza. Children pointed excitedly toward him, asking if he was a police dog, but Titan never broke formation. He stayed exactly one step behind Ethan's left knee. Always. It had been nearly 9 months since Ethan had left New Jersey to work as part of an international security advisory team protecting World Cup venues across North America. While millions remembered goals and trophies, Ethan remembered rooftops, bomb drills, evacuation routes, and nights without sleep. His wife Vanessa often joked that Ethan had seen more loading docks than soccer games. She wasn't wrong. The final whistle had blown only 3 hours earlier, yet Ethan had quietly slipped away before the celebrations ended. He wanted something far more important than photographs with colleagues. He wanted to surprise his father. Harold Mercer still lived only 20 minutes away in the modest apartment Ethan had purchased after retirement. Every month, exactly $3,000 left Ethan's military pension account and arrived in Harold's bank account. His father always complained it was too much. "You earned it," Harold would say. "So did you," Ethan always answered. Their conversations were never long. Harold had spent 40 years repairing stadium seats, school bleachers, church pews, and wooden floors throughout New Jersey. He believed love was measured by repaired things, not spoken words. When Ethan was 10 years old, Harold had built him a soccer goal from leftover lumber behind an old warehouse. When Ethan enlisted, Harold never cried in front of him. Instead, he quietly replaced the broken porch light before Ethan left. That was his language. Fix what you can. Leave the light on. Ethan smiled faintly at the memory. Maybe tonight they would finally sit together and watch the replay of the World Cup final. No crowds, no security radios, just father and son. Titan suddenly stopped. The leash tightened. Ethan took another step before realizing the dog had planted all four paws against the pavement. Titan, nothing. The German shepherd's ears stood rigid, his nose lifted into the breeze. Not excitement, concern. Ethan knew every sound Titan could make. This low, troubled whine belonged to only one thing: human suffering. He followed the dog's stare across the plaza toward a quieter service entrance where stadium workers hauled away trash bags filled with discarded food containers. A handful of elderly people stood nearby, waiting politely. Some collected empty cans. Others searched half-finished meals abandoned after the celebration. Titan's breathing became uneven. His tail lowered. Then Ethan saw him. An old man sat on a folding crate beside the concrete wall, wearing an oversized gray jacket despite the warm evening. His silver hair escaped beneath a faded baseball cap, embroidered with the logo of the 1994 FIFA World Cup. In trembling hands, he held a small white paper cup, not for money, for leftover food. "Please," the old man whispered to a family walking past, "if you aren't going to finish your rice, could I have just a little?" The family looked away. A teenage boy hesitated before following his parents. Another group walked past without slowing down. The old man thanked them anyway. Ethan felt irritation before recognition. Something about the man's bent left shoulder, the scar near his jaw, the fingers permanently curved from decades of gripping hammers. Time seemed to narrow into absolute silence. "Dad." The word escaped before Ethan realized he had spoken. The old man slowly raised his head. His hazel eyes widened. Fear appeared first. Joy arrived only afterward. "Danny." No one had called him Danny in over 20 years. The duffel bag slipped from Ethan's hand. He crossed the pavement in 3 hurried strides, nearly colliding with a food cart. Up close, the truth struck harder. Harold looked 20 years older than when Ethan had last seen him on a video call. His cheeks had collapsed inward. His beard had grown unevenly. The jacket hanging from his shoulders was one Ethan remembered from high school. Back then, it had barely buttoned. Now it swallowed him. "Dad," Ethan whispered again. What are you doing here?" Harold instinctively lowered the paper cup behind one knee, as though hiding it could erase what his son had already seen. "You came home early," his voice cracked. "I wasn't expecting—" Ethan knelt beside him. "Why are you asking people for food?" Harold forced a tired smile. "It's nothing." "No, it really is." "Dad, I'm fine." The words were painfully familiar. Ethan had heard wounded Marines say them while bleeding through body armor. He had never imagined hearing them from his own father. Then Titan stepped forward. The German shepherd ignored the paper cup entirely. Instead, he buried his nose into Harold's weathered backpack. He sniffed once, twice, then suddenly scratched hard at one hidden compartment near the bottom. Ethan frowned. Titan never searched without reason. "What is it, buddy?" The dog scratched again, harder. Harold's expression changed. Not embarrassment, fear, real fear. Before Ethan could unzip the compartment, Harold swayed. The paper cup slipped from his fingers. Rice scattered across the concrete. Then his father collapsed into his arms, and Titan began barking, not at the crowd, but at the worn backpack lying beside Harold, as if whatever was hidden inside was the real reason an old man had been begging outside the biggest stadium in the world. The ambulance siren faded beneath the glow of stadium lights as MetLife Stadium slowly emptied behind them. Less than an hour earlier, nearly 80,000 people had been celebrating the greatest soccer tournament in the world. Now Ethan Mercer sat in silence beside his unconscious father, wondering how triumph and tragedy could exist on opposite sides of the same parking lot. Titan lay on the ambulance floor, refusing to leave Harold's side. The German shepherd rested his muzzle against the old man's motionless hand, his amber eyes never blinking. Dogs understood weakness differently than people did. People search for explanations. Dogs search for heartbeats. At Hackensack University Medical Center, doctors moved quickly. A nurse cut away Harold's oversized jacket, while another attached oxygen tubing and heart monitors. Ethan stood just outside the curtain, his fists opening and closing without realizing it. During 21 years in the Marines, he had waited outside operating rooms for wounded teammates. He had never imagined standing there for his father. Dr. Monica Reeves entered carrying a tablet. At 58, she possessed the calm voice of someone who had spent decades delivering difficult truths. She finished examining Harold before turning toward Ethan. Mr. Mercer has severe pneumonia, advanced dehydration, and prolonged malnutrition. Ethan frowned. How long? She hesitated. Not days. Her eyes softened. Months. The word echoed louder than the heart monitor. Months. Not one missed meal. Not one bad week. Months. Ethan leaned against the wall. Every month. $3,000. Automatically transferred. Without fail. He remembered every conversation with Vanessa. Your dad's doing great. He finally fixed the balcony. He says thank you, but stop sending so much money. Every sentence had sounded ordinary. Ordinary lies were always the hardest to detect. Doctor, Reeves continued, his blood pressure medication hasn't been taken consistently. Can you tell? The prescription gap suggests several months. Ethan closed his eyes. His father had heart disease. Missing medication wasn't neglect, it was a countdown. A gentle knock interrupted them. An elderly volunteer wearing a World Cup credential stepped into the hallway. My name is Rosa Delgado, she said quietly. I work with guest assistants at the stadium. Ethan nodded. I've seen your father nearly every home match. His head lifted. What? Rosa looked ashamed. He never begged for money. She swallowed. He only waited until families threw away food. Her words painted pictures Ethan wished he could erase. Harold standing outside luxury suites, watching children leave half-eaten rice bowls, waiting until everyone walked away, then quietly asking, if you won't finish it, may I? Ethan's stomach twisted. My father, Rosa nodded. He always thanked people. He apologized for bothering them. He told everyone his grandson loved soccer. Ethan frowned. Grandson? I assumed, she smiled sadly. He talked about family all the time. He never complained. Never. That sounded exactly like Harold. Pain to him was something repaired privately. Just as Ethan had learned to hide fear beneath discipline, Harold had learned to hide suffering beneath gratitude. Grace often looked like strength. Sometimes it looked like silence. An hour later, Harold finally opened his eyes. His breathing remained shallow, but he managed a weak smile when he saw Ethan. You shouldn't have come home early. Ethan almost laughed. His father was apologizing. Again. Dad. Harold slowly reached for Ethan's wrist. Don't blame Sophie. The words were barely audible. She tried. Tried what? Harold looked toward the doorway where Titan now sat perfectly still. She didn't know. What didn't she know? Harold closed his eyes again before answering. Some prisons don't have bars. Within minutes, he drifted back to sleep. The sentence remained hanging inside Ethan's mind. Some prisons don't have bars. Rosa eventually left after giving Ethan her phone number in case he needed a witness. Before leaving, she quietly handed him Harold's worn backpack. He wouldn't let anyone touch it. Ethan carried it into the waiting room. Titan immediately stood. Without command, without hesitation. The German shepherd walked directly toward the same hidden compartment he had scratched outside the stadium. He pawed it once, twice, then sat. Ethan unzipped the pocket. Inside lay only three things: an empty medication bottle, a folded family photograph, and a key. A small brass key with faded blue tape wrapped around its head. Written on the tape in Harold's careful handwriting were four words: kitchen pantry, spare key. Ethan stared. Pantry? His father didn't need a key to his own kitchen. Unless Someone else had decided he no longer belonged inside it. His pulse quickened. The apartment suddenly felt less like home and more like a crime scene waiting to be opened. Outside the hospital window, fireworks from the World Cup closing ceremony exploded above the New Jersey skyline. People cheered beneath brilliant colors. Inside the quiet waiting room, Ethan closed his hand around the tiny brass key. Titan stood beside him. The dog's ears lifted toward the door as though he already knew where they were going next. And for the first time since returning home, Ethan realized that whatever had nearly killed his father had probably never started outside the apartment. It had started inside the kitchen, behind a locked pantry door. The apartment smelled strangely clean, not like Harold. As Ethan unlocked the front door using his own spare key, he immediately noticed the scent of lemon polish hanging in the air. Every picture frame stood perfectly straight. The couch cushions looked untouched. A bowl of decorative fruit sat in the center of the dining table, so flawless it might have belonged in a furniture showroom instead of the home of a retired carpenter. Everything looked curated. His father had never lived like this. Harold Mercer had always believed a house should look lived in. There would usually be sawdust near the workshop door, newspapers folded beside his favorite chair, coffee rings on the porch railing, and half-finished woodworking projects waiting patiently for another afternoon. This apartment felt like a stage set, beautiful, empty. Titan stepped inside ahead of Ethan. Instead of sniffing around excitedly like most dogs returning to a familiar place, the German Shepherd lowered his head and moved with slow, deliberate caution, searching, listening, remembering. Ethan followed him toward the kitchen. The room appeared fully stocked. Fresh fruit, imported olive oil, expensive cheeses, prime steaks inside the refrigerator. Everything looked exactly as Vanessa had described during their weekly phone calls. "Dad's eating better than we are. You should see how spoiled he's become." Those words echoed bitterly now. Titan ignored every smell from the refrigerator. Instead, he walked toward a narrow hallway. There, behind a folding partition, Ethan froze. A tiny room barely large enough for a single cot had been converted into someone's bedroom, his father's bedroom. The mattress sagged in the center. A faded military blanket covered it. A cracked reading lamp leaned sideways on a milk crate. Next to the pillow sat 3 paperback novels Harold had read years ago, each marked with scraps of cardboard instead of bookmarks. The air carried a faint smell of damp fabric. Nothing else. No television, no family photographs, no comfortable chair. Nothing suggested that the man who paid half the mortgage on this apartment actually lived in the rest of it. Ethan's chest tightened. Why would his father choose this room? Unless he hadn't chosen. Titan circled once before stopping beside the kitchenette pantry. The heavy wooden door was secured with a brand new stainless steel padlock. Ethan stared. A pantry, locked, inside his father's own home. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small brass key Harold had hidden inside the backpack. Kitchen pantry, spare key. The handwriting suddenly made terrible sense. Someone had forced Harold to hide a spare key inside his own backpack. His hand trembled as the key slid into the lock. Click. The padlock released. The pantry door creaked open. Shelves overflowed with canned soup, pasta, cereal, bottled water, rice, peanut butter, coffee, and fresh snacks. Enough food to feed someone for months. Yet on the lowest shelf sat something that made Ethan stop breathing. 5 instant noodle cups. Each one expired. Each one opened. Each one carefully cleaned and stacked together. Harold hadn't been living on the food inside this pantry. He'd been surviving on leftovers. Ethan slowly reached toward the shelves. Most packages carried neat adhesive labels. Vanessa, guests, party supplies, weekend. Nothing said Harold. Nothing. His father hadn't been denied food because there wasn't any. He had been denied permission. The realization felt colder than rage. Titan suddenly gave a soft whine, Not at the shelves, at the back wall. The German shepherd pressed his nose into the corner behind several large bags of rice. He pawed once, twice, then looked directly at Ethan. "I know." Ethan carefully moved the supplies aside. The drywall sounded hollow. Someone had covered a narrow opening with a thin plywood panel painted to match the wall. He slipped his fingers behind it. The panel came loose. Inside rested a weathered blue notebook wrapped inside a plastic grocery bag. Nothing else. No jewelry, no cash, only the notebook. On the cover, written in Harold's familiar block letters, were 6 simple words. "For Ethan, only if necessary." His throat tightened. Harold had never written dramatic letters. If he had hidden something, he must have believed no one would believe him otherwise. Ethan opened the first page. The handwriting looked shakier than he remembered. "If you're reading this, son, I finally ran out of ways to protect everyone by staying quiet." He swallowed hard. The next lines were dated almost 8 months earlier. "Vanessa says you're too busy protecting the World Cup to worry about an old man. She tells me not to call because you'll only feel guilty. I want to believe her, because believing anything else hurts too much." Ethan's vision blurred. He remembered every missed call. Every month Vanessa casually saying, "Your dad must have forgotten his phone again." Another page. "She changed my bank password. Said she'd help me manage my money because my memory isn't as sharp anymore. I signed the papers without reading them. That was foolish." Another. "The phone disappeared for 3 days. When it came back, your number was gone. She said I accidentally deleted it." Ethan gripped the notebook tighter. His breathing grew uneven. Titan rested his head gently against Ethan's knee, sensing the storm building inside him. The entries became shorter, more fragile. "I'm eating less these days. She says groceries are expensive during the tournament. I don't want to be a burden." Then another. "I stood outside the stadium today. A little boy shared half his rice bowl with me. I cried after he left because he reminded me of you when you were 8. A tear slipped silently onto the page. Ethan wiped it away too late. The ink blurred beneath his thumb. He turned to the final completed entry. His entire body went still. "I overheard Vanessa talking on the phone today. She said everything would be easier once the World Cup ended, because the apartment would finally be sold and I'd be gone before you came home." Ethan stared at those words in stunned silence. Then Titan suddenly lifted his head. His ears locked toward the front door. Someone had just inserted a key into the apartment lock. The deadbolt turned slowly. Ethan reacted before he had time to think. Years of military training took over. He quietly slipped the blue notebook beneath his jacket, motioned for Titan to stay silent, and stepped behind the hallway wall where he could see the front entrance without being seen himself. Titan obeyed instantly. The German shepherd lowered his body to the floor, every muscle tense, ears fixed toward the door. A second later, it opened. Vanessa Mercer walked inside carrying 2 expensive shopping bags and a designer handbag over one shoulder. She looked exactly as she had on the video calls during the World Cup. Perfect hair, flawless makeup, pressed white blouse. She smiled as she kicked off her shoes. "Harold?" No answer. "I brought your medication." She set a pharmacy bag on the kitchen counter without looking toward the hallway. Titan didn't move. Neither did Ethan. Vanessa sighed dramatically. "You can't keep wandering off like this." Her tone wasn't worried. It was irritated. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number. The call connected almost immediately. "He's not here." A pause. "No, don't panic." Another pause. "I told you the World Cup ended today." Ethan's heartbeat quickened. She wasn't surprised he was missing. She was reporting it. He couldn't have gone far. Silence. Then she lowered her voice. "If Ethan somehow came home early," she stopped, "then we move everything tonight." Ethan felt his jaw tighten. Everything. What exactly was everything? Vanessa ended the call and immediately walked toward Harold's tiny bedroom. She barely glanced inside before shaking her head. Stubborn old man. Then she returned to the kitchen. She opened the pantry. Ethan watched her carefully. Instead of taking food, she reached behind the highest shelf and removed a slim, black folder Ethan had never noticed. She checked its contents. Satisfied, she slipped it into her handbag. Titan released the faintest growl. Vanessa froze. She slowly turned. Titan? Her smile returned instantly. There you are. The German shepherd didn't wag his tail. He stood. His body blocked the hallway. She frowned. Where's Ethan? Silence. Ethan? She laughed nervously. This isn't funny. Then she noticed the missing padlock hanging open on the pantry door. Her expression changed. She rushed forward. The rice bags had been moved. The hidden compartment stood open. The blue notebook was gone. For the first time since Ethan had known her, Vanessa looked genuinely afraid. No, she whispered. No, no, no. She dropped to her knees and searched frantically behind the shelves, as though hoping the notebook had somehow reappeared. It can't be gone. Ethan stepped into the kitchen. It is. Vanessa spun around so quickly she nearly fell backward. Ethan! The color drained from her face. When did you get home? This afternoon. You should have called. So you could prepare? Her lips parted. I don't know what you mean. He slowly held up the notebook. Recognition flashed across her eyes before she forced another smile. Oh, that. Harold writes strange stories when he's lonely. They're not stories. He gets confused. He remembers things that never happened. Ethan stared at her. My father has pneumonia. I know. He's severely malnourished. She crossed her arms. He refuses to eat. He begged for leftover rice outside MetLife Stadium. I told him not to go there. You knew? He wouldn't listen. Ethan took one slow step closer. The pantry was locked. I locked it. Why? So he wouldn't eat unhealthy snacks. Ethan almost laughed. The pantry was full of food. I managed his diet. He was starving. He has dementia. He doesn't. He forgets. He remembers everything. Silence filled the kitchen. Vanessa looked toward the front door. Not at Ethan. At the exit. She was calculating, looking for a way out. Then Ethan noticed something else. On the dining table sat a thick stack of papers beneath a crystal paperweight. He walked over and picked them up. Real estate contracts, the apartment, sale price, closing date, 3 days from now. Seller, Harold Mercer. Buyer's signature already completed. Harold's signature appeared beside it. Ethan studied it for several seconds. Something felt wrong. The handwriting shook unnaturally. Letters leaned in different directions. Not Harold's careful printing, a forgery. He slowly raised his eyes. My father never signed this. Vanessa's voice hardened. You can't prove that. Before Ethan could answer, Titan suddenly barked once. A sharp, explosive warning. Not at Vanessa, at the living room window. Both adults turned simultaneously. Outside, a black SUV had just stopped across the street. 2 men stepped out. Neither knocked. Instead, one pointed toward the apartment building while speaking into his phone. Vanessa's face became almost as pale as Harold's had been in the hospital. She whispered only 4 words. They came too early. Ethan looked from the strangers to the forged contracts in his hands, then back at his wife. For the first time, he realized this had grown far beyond one starving old man. Someone else wanted Harold's apartment, and judging by the men outside, they were no longer willing to wait. For several long seconds, no one moved. The 2 men remained outside the apartment building, speaking quietly beside the black SUV. One checked his watch while the other looked up toward Harold's apartment, as if confirming the unit number. Inside, the silence was suffocating. Ethan slowly folded the forged sales contract and slipped it into his jacket beside the blue notebook. Vanessa watched every movement. Who are they? He asked. I don't know. You recognize them. I didn't. You said they came too early. She looked away. I was nervous. You were expecting someone. No. Her answers were becoming shorter, less convincing. Titan never took his eyes off her. The German Shepherd had always loved Vanessa. When Ethan was deployed overseas years earlier, Titan would sleep beside her bedroom door every night until Ethan came home. Now the dog stood between them like a silent witness. Animals never cared about excuses, only truth. A vibration broke the silence. Vanessa's phone lit up on the kitchen counter. She lunged toward it. Too late. Ethan reached it first. The caller ID displayed only one name, Martin Doyle. The call stopped before he could answer. Almost immediately, a text message appeared. Is the old man gone yet? The buyer refuses another delay. Ethan felt his stomach turn cold. He looked up slowly. The buyer? Vanessa's lips parted, but no words came. Another message arrived. The social worker will be there tomorrow. Make sure Harold signs the competency papers before Ethan gets involved. Social worker? Competency papers? The puzzle was finally beginning to fit together. Someone wanted Harold legally declared incapable of making his own decisions. Once that happened, selling the apartment would become easy. Vanessa suddenly reached for the phone. Ethan, let me explain. He stepped back. No, it isn't what you think. My father nearly died begging for leftovers. You don't understand. Then help me understand. Tears filled her eyes. For a brief moment, Ethan almost believed them. Then Titan growled. Not loudly, just enough. The same growl he used during military operations, whenever someone smiled while preparing to attack. Ethan trusted that growl more than tears. A knock echoed through the apartment. 3 quick taps. Not the strangers downstairs. A woman. Vanessa's shoulders stiffened. I'll get it, Ethan said. When he opened the door, a young woman stood nervously in the hallway, holding a reusable grocery bag filled with soup containers and fresh bread. She couldn't have been older than 23. Dark brown hair was tied into a simple ponytail beneath a MetLife Stadium employee cap. Her security credentials still hung around her neck from the World Cup. The moment she saw Ethan, her face drained of color. I'm sorry. I thought Mr. Harold was home. Ethan studied her carefully. You know my father? The young woman nodded. Every week. Vanessa suddenly appeared behind Ethan. Sophie. The young woman froze. You shouldn't be here. I had to. Vanessa's voice became sharp. Leave. Instead, Sophie looked directly at Ethan. Is he alive? The question wasn't casual. It carried weeks of fear. He's in the hospital. Relief flooded her face. She covered her mouth as tears spilled freely. Oh, thank God. She whispered it like someone who had been praying for exactly that answer. Vanessa grabbed Sophie's arm. I said leave. Ethan stepped between them. No, he looked at Sophie. Come inside. She hesitated only a moment. Titan walked toward her. The German Shepherd sniffed her hands once before gently pressing his head against her leg. Ethan noticed something remarkable. Titan trusted her. Completely. Dogs remembered kindness. Sophie knelt beside Titan, scratching behind his ears. I've missed you, handsome. Titan's tail wagged for the first time all day. Ethan watched carefully. When was the last time you saw him? Before you left for the tournament. You know Titan? She smiled weakly. I used to bring him treats. Her voice trembled. And Mr. Harold always said I spoiled him. Harold had never mentioned her. Why? Unless he had been protecting her. Sophie finally looked at Ethan. I'm sorry. For what? I couldn't stop this. Vanessa interrupted. Don't listen to her. But Sophie continued anyway. Mr. Harold never wanted you to worry. Ethan's heart sank. He knew? He knew your calls weren't reaching him. Sophie nodded. I tried giving him my phone. What happened? Your wife found out. The room fell silent. Sophie slowly rolled up the sleeve of her cardigan. A fading bruise circled her wrist. She grabbed me. Vanessa immediately shook her head. She's lying. I told Mr. Harold to call the police. What did he say? Sophie smiled sadly. He said, she paused, trying not to cry, I've already lost one family. I won't destroy another trying to save myself. Ethan closed his eyes. That sounded exactly like his father, always carrying pain alone, always believing sacrifice could protect the people he loved. Sophie wiped away another tear. I started bringing him food after my shifts. Where? The loading dock behind the stadium. She pointed toward the grocery bag. Chicken soup, soft bread, fruit. He always ate half, and told me to take the rest home. Ethan remembered Rosa saying Harold often talked about his grandson. Now he understood. Harold had been inventing stories, not because he was confused, but because he was protecting Sophie from questions, protecting yet another lonely soul. Then Sophie reached into her backpack. I almost forgot. She removed a small white envelope. Mr. Harold told me, if anything happened to him, I should give this only to you. Ethan accepted it carefully. His father's handwriting covered the front. For my son, before you judge anyone. Confused, he opened the envelope. Inside was a single photograph. His hands began to shake. The picture showed a much younger Vanessa, standing beside a frightened 16-year-old Sophie. Behind them hung a sign outside a county foster care office. Across the back of the photo, Harold had written one heartbreaking sentence. She isn't who you think she is, and neither is Sophie. No one spoke. Ethan stared at the old photograph as though it belonged to someone else's life. Vanessa, young, smiling, beside a frightened teenage girl whose oversized sweatshirt swallowed her thin frame. Sophie, the county foster care sign behind them, left no room for misunderstanding. His wife had known Sophie long before Ethan ever met either of them. He slowly turned the photograph over again. She isn't who you think she is, and neither is Sophie. Harold's handwriting looked steady, intentional. He had wanted Ethan to pause before judging, not to forgive, to understand. Ethan looked at Sophie. Tell me the truth. She lowered her eyes. I will. Vanessa suddenly stepped forward. You don't owe him anything. I owe him everything, Sophie answered quietly. That sentence struck Ethan harder than shouting ever could. Sophie sat at the kitchen table while Titan rested beside her chair. The German shepherd leaned gently against her leg, sensing the fear trembling through her body. I was 16 when I met Vanessa. She folded her hands tightly together. I'd been living in foster care for almost 6 years. My parents died in a highway accident. I bounced between homes. Her voice remained calm, too calm, like someone who had repeated the story enough times that tears no longer arrived where they once had. Vanessa volunteered at the youth center. Ethan frowned. You volunteered? He looked toward his wife. She said nothing. Sophie continued. She bought me clothes, helped me apply for community college. For a while, she was the closest thing I had to family. Ethan remembered those years. Vanessa had often spoken about volunteering. He had admired her compassion. Had that compassion ever been real? When did you meet my father? The day Vanessa introduced us. Sophie's face softened. Mr. Harold made grilled cheese sandwiches. He said every lonely person deserved homemade food. A faint smile appeared. He wrapped 2 extra sandwiches in foil before I left. I asked why. He said, loneliness usually comes back before hunger does. Ethan smiled despite the ache in his chest. That sounded exactly like Harold. Simple words, endless kindness. Sophie looked down at her hands again. After you married Vanessa, I stopped visiting. Why? She didn't want me around anymore, Vanessa finally exploded. Because you became obsessed with this family. No, I was grateful. You kept showing up. Because Harold kept inviting me. He pitied you. He loved me. The room fell silent. Not romantic love, something much deeper. The quiet love of a father who refused to let another abandoned child disappear into the world unnoticed. Sophie reached into her backpack again. This time she removed a folded birthday card. Its edges were worn from being opened many times. She handed it to Ethan. "Read it." Inside, Harold had written in careful blue ink, "Happy birthday, sweetheart. Never believe that being left behind means you weren't worth keeping. Families are built every day by people who choose each other. I'll always save you a seat at my table. Love, Harold." Ethan felt tears gathering. There was no mention of blood, no mention of obligation, only choice. Family, to Harold, had always been a decision, not an accident of birth. "I visited every month," Sophie whispered, "sometimes just for coffee, sometimes to help clean, sometimes because he looked lonely." She hesitated. "Everything changed about 8 months ago." "The notebook," Ethan said. She nodded. "Vanessa started controlling everything. The bank cards, the phone, the medication, the visitors. I wasn't allowed inside anymore. So what did you do?" "I met him behind the stadium, every Tuesday, every Friday, after finishing her shift at MetLife. She would leave through the employee loading dock carrying a backpack filled with soup, fruit, sandwiches, and medicine she purchased herself. Harold would already be waiting on a concrete bench behind the delivery entrance. Not because he liked begging, because it was the only place Vanessa couldn't watch him. I begged him to tell you. He refused." "Why?" Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "He said," Ethan finally smiles again after the war, "I won't be the reason that smile disappears." Ethan covered his face. Even while starving, his father had worried more about his son's happiness than his own survival. That realization broke something inside him. Titan quietly rested his head across Ethan's knee. The familiar weight steadied him. After several minutes, Ethan lowered his hands. "There's still something I don't understand." He looked directly at Vanessa. "If you wanted the apartment, why involve Sophie?" Vanessa laughed bitterly. "I didn't." Sophie slowly stood. "I think it's time he knows." She reached beneath the collar of her shirt. A thin, silver chain slipped into view. At its end hung half of a small, heart-shaped pendant. Ethan stared. His father wore the other half. Always. For as long as Ethan could remember. Sophie unclasped the necklace and placed it on the table. "Mr. Harold gave me this. He said he'd been saving it for the day you were ready to hear the truth." Ethan looked from the pendant to the old photograph, then to his wife. "What truth?" Sophie took a long, trembling breath. "The woman who died in the car accident wasn't only my mother." She looked directly into Ethan's eyes. She was Harold's daughter. The room became impossibly still. Ethan's heartbeat thundered in his ears. His father had lost a daughter, and for years he had quietly loved his granddaughter, without ever telling his own son. The room fell silent. Even Vanessa stopped breathing. Ethan looked at Sophie, unable to speak. The words echoed through his mind. She was Harold's daughter. His father had another child. A daughter he had never known existed, or had known, and lost. Sophie sat back down, her hands shaking. "I only found out 3 years ago." Ethan stared at her. "You didn't always know?" She slowly shook her head. "My parents raised me believing I was their only child. When they died, I found a small box among their things. Inside was my birth certificate, my mother's journal, and letters." She looked toward the photograph lying on the table. "My mother never told Harold she was pregnant." Ethan frowned. "Why?" "Because they hadn't spoken in years." The answer hurt before she even explained it. "My grandfather wanted Harold to leave carpentry and join the family construction business. He refused. They argued. My mother left with my father. For years, no one spoke." Sophie swallowed. "Then the accident happened. Harold never even had the chance to say goodbye. The room felt unbearably heavy. Ethan remembered the darkest period of his childhood. He had been only 14 when his father suddenly became quieter. He stopped singing while working in the garage, stopped decorating for Christmas, stopped laughing the way fathers should. Ethan had always assumed it was because his own mother had died years earlier. Now he understood. Harold had been grieving twice. He had buried his daughter without ever meeting her child. "When did he find you?" Sophie smiled through tears. "I found him." She reached into the grocery bag and removed another worn notebook. "This belonged to my mother." Inside were dozens of family photographs. One picture showed a much younger Harold holding a little girl on his shoulders beside a lake. Both were laughing. Another showed the same little girl painting birdhouses with him. My mother wrote his name on the back. I searched online. It took me almost 6 months. When I finally knocked on his door, she laughed softly, he already knew who I was. "How?" He said, "You've got your mother's eyes." Tears rolled freely down Sophie's cheeks. He hugged me before I even introduced myself. Across the room, Vanessa looked away. For the first time, shame replaced defiance. Ethan slowly turned toward her. "Did you know?" She nodded almost imperceptibly. "I found out after Harold did." "And?" "I was afraid." "Of what?" She finally looked him in the eyes. "That everything would change." It did. "I thought, if Harold rewrote his will, we'd lose everything." The confession hung in the air. No excuses, no lies, only greed. "I never meant for him to starve." "But you let him." "I thought he'd give in." "You locked food away." "I wanted him to sign." "You isolated him." "I panicked." Ethan shook his head slowly. "My father treated you like his own daughter." Vanessa began crying. Real tears this time. "He did." "I know. And I betrayed him." The words sounded honest, but honesty arrived far too late. Another knock interrupted the silence. This one was firm, professional. When Ethan opened the door, 2 police detectives stood outside beside the apartment manager. One detective held up a badge. "Mr. Ethan Mercer?" "Yes." "We received reports of suspected elder financial abuse." Ethan glanced at Sophie. She lowered her eyes. "I called them." "At the hospital." "I was afraid I was already too late." The detective entered quietly. Within minutes, photographs had been taken, the forged contracts collected, Harold's notebook placed into evidence. The text messages from Martin Doyle were copied directly from Vanessa's phone. The second detective turned toward Vanessa. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us." She closed her eyes. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then she removed her wedding ring. She placed it gently on the kitchen table, not dramatically, not angrily, simply, like someone accepting the consequences she could no longer outrun. As officers escorted her toward the hallway, she stopped beside Sophie. "I'm sorry." Sophie didn't answer. Some wounds were too deep for forgiveness to arrive in a single afternoon. The apartment became strangely quiet after they left. Only Ethan, Sophie, and Titan remained. The silence no longer felt frightening. It felt honest. Ethan looked again at the 2 halves of the silver heart pendant. Without speaking, Sophie removed her half. Ethan gently fitted it against the half Harold still wore every day. The broken heart became whole again. Neither of them noticed they were both crying. Later that evening, Ethan and Sophie returned to the hospital together. Harold was awake, weak, but smiling. He looked first at Ethan, then at Sophie, then at the rejoined pendant lying in Ethan's hand. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Harold's weathered eyes filled with tears. "You know," Ethan nodded. "I know everything." His father looked toward Sophie. "I'm sorry it took me so long." She rushed to his bedside and embraced him carefully, mindful of the oxygen tubes. "You found me. That's all that matters." Harold wrapped one frail arm around his granddaughter. The family he thought had disappeared forever had found its way back. Ethan stood quietly beside the bed while Titan rested his head on Harold's blanket. The old man scratched the German shepherd's ears with trembling fingers. Then he looked at his son. "I always wanted you two to meet." Ethan smiled through tears. "We're not meeting today." He reached across the bed and took Sophie's hand. "We're coming home together." For the first time in many years, Harold's smile reached his eyes. 3 months later, the first cold wind of autumn swept through East Rutherford. The World Cup banners had long since disappeared. The cheering crowds were gone. Only ordinary life remained. And for Ethan Mercer, ordinary life had never felt more extraordinary. He parked his pickup beside a modest brick building less than a mile from MetLife Stadium. Above the entrance hung a simple wooden sign: Harold's Table, free meals, open hearts, no questions asked. Beneath it, another smaller sign read, "No one should ever have to beg for leftovers again." Inside, the dining room buzzed with quiet conversation. Retirees sat beside construction workers. Single mothers shared tables with veterans. A few homeless men warmed their hands around bowls of homemade soup. No one asked where anyone had come from, only whether they wanted another piece of bread. Harold stood behind the serving counter wearing a blue apron that read, "Head Soup Maker." His cheeks had regained their color. The cane he now carried rested against the wall beside him. The pneumonia was gone. The hunger had faded. Only the wrinkles remained. And somehow, even they looked lighter. He smiled as he ladled chicken soup into another bowl. "There you go, my friend. Extra carrots today." The elderly man receiving the bowl laughed. "You always remember," Harold winked. "When someone comes here hungry, they're already family." Across the room, Ethan watched quietly. Those words no longer surprised him. He finally understood his father. Harold had spent his whole life building families, not with blood, but with kindness. Titan wandered through the dining room like he owned the place. Children hugged him. Veterans scratched behind his ears. The German shepherd greeted every newcomer before calmly leading them toward an empty seat, almost as if he understood the building's only rule: no one should ever sit alone. Near the kitchen doorway, Sophie finished arranging fresh bread into baskets. She had moved into Ethan's home shortly after Harold left the hospital. Not because anyone felt obligated, because none of them wanted another empty chair at the dinner table. She had returned to community college. Harold insisted on driving her to class every Tuesday morning. "I've missed enough years already," he always joked. Ethan often caught them arguing over music in the truck, or laughing over terrible coffee. It sounded exactly like a grandfather and granddaughter making up for lost time. One afternoon, he realized he had stopped thinking of Sophie as Harold's granddaughter. She was simply his sister, not by blood, but by choice. The investigation had ended 6 weeks earlier. Martin Doyle and 2 associates had been charged with conspiracy, elder financial exploitation, and document fraud after detectives uncovered similar schemes involving several elderly homeowners. Vanessa accepted responsibility for her role. She pleaded guilty to financial abuse and forgery. She later sent Harold a handwritten letter asking for forgiveness. Harold read it quietly, folded it, placed it inside his Bible. "I forgive her," he told Ethan, "but forgiveness doesn't erase consequences." It was the last time he spoke about her. One rainy afternoon, Ethan apologized for something he had carried in silence. "I'm sorry I didn't see it." Harold looked puzzled. "You were starving. I was protecting you." "I should have been protecting you." The old man smiled gently. "You came home. You believed me." "Son, sometimes love arrives late, but it still arrives." Ethan hugged his father longer than he ever had as a child. Neither man was ashamed of the tears. Near closing time, Titan suddenly lifted his head. His ears twitched. Without barking, he trotted toward the front door. A thin, elderly man stood outside, soaked by the rain. His clothes were worn, his hands trembled. He hesitated before stepping inside. "I don't have any money." Harold walked around the counter himself. He placed a warm hand on the stranger's shoulder. "We don't serve money here." He guided the man to the first table. Moments later, he returned carrying the biggest bowl of soup in the kitchen. Fresh bread, a slice of pie, hot coffee. The old stranger stared in disbelief. "I can't repay this." Harold smiled. "You don't have to." Then he spoke the sentence that had lived in his heart long before Ethan ever understood it. No one should ever have to beg for leftovers again. The dining room fell quiet, not because people were watching, because everyone understood. Ethan looked across the room. His father was smiling. Sophie was laughing with volunteers. Titan rested beneath Harold's chair, finally peaceful. For the first time since returning from the World Cup, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt since before the war. Home. Not because every wound had healed, not because every mistake had been erased, but because love had found its way back to the people who chose one another. And sometimes, that was the greatest victory a family could ever win. As we come to the end of this story, perhaps the greatest miracle wasn't that a family was reunited. It was that love never stopped waiting. Sometimes, God doesn't perform miracles with thunder or lightning. Sometimes he works quietly through a faithful father, a loyal dog, a stranger's kindness, or a heart that refuses to give up. Even when life feels unfair, God can restore what seems forever lost in ways we could never imagine. If you're carrying pain today, don't lose hope. Keep choosing kindness. Keep forgiving when you can. Keep believing that every small act of love matters, because the seeds you plant today may become someone else's miracle tomorrow. Remember, the richest people are not those who own the most, but those who leave the most love behind. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to share it with someone who may need a little hope today. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and tell us one act of kindness you've experienced or given. We'd love to read your story. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories like this, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Your support helps us continue creating stories that inspire compassion, forgiveness, faith, and hope. May God bless you and your family with peace in your heart, strength in difficult times, good health, and people who truly love you. May He guide your steps, protect your home, and remind you every day that you are never walking alone. Thank you for watching. Until next time, may God's grace be with you always.